with that. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Jessica Johnston. I'm the Director of Development for the Pacific Birth Institute, and we are birth working. On this week's episode, we're going to chat with Kiona Nessenbaum. She is the owner and the beautiful voice we hear on Birth as We Know It podcast. Kiona, will you say hi to everybody?
Hello, everyone. How's it going?
Oh, I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad you're here. We're going to let people come in. We're actually doing this a little fun today. We have a little Zoom format. And so we'll ask, I think
Mhm.
everybody will be muted upon entry, and we're going to keep our conversation going. But we want this to be still full chat space, camera on, camera off, whatever you prefer. Let's have a full chat going in the chat box because I want Kiona to be able to speak. And then we're going to open it up for questions. And we might open it up for some auditory because we have the capacity today. So I'm going to pin you, Kiona, and keep you right front and center for our video because that's the
Beautiful.
best part about having Zoom, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, tell us about who you are. I want to hear everything about you.
Oh my goodness. Where to start? So I'll just start with the basics of I am Kiona. I'm a mother of three. I have an 11-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 3-year-old. And I am a birth worker. And in the role of birth worker, I am a birth doula, a birth assistant, as well as a postpartum doula and a former student midwife. So kind of just dabbling in all areas of birth and on all sides, postpartum, prenatally, and all that good stuff. I am, as you mentioned, the host of the Birth as We Know It podcast, and that just celebrated its 2-year mark, which is amazing because it's so
Yay.
much fun to connect with people. What I do on my podcast is interview birthing people, partners, providers, birth workers, and more. And I just have people come on. Well, not just have people come on, but I have people come on and talk about their birth stories and experiences, the good, the bad, the in between, all that good stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that is exciting because today's talk that we're going to have is the healing is in the conversation. And not to
Mhm.
rush us right into the topic, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about the strength you carry around the unveiling the power of birth story.
Oh man. The birth stories are so incredibly important. And the reason why I don't only share the positive stories is because there's a lot of negative or traumatic stories out there too. And if they're not talked about, the person who experiences it feels isolated and alone and feels like they're the only one that has ever experienced something to that level. And once you actually get into the depths of these conversations and of these stories, the connection that you make with the people around you is so immense. And it truly brings the human experience back into birth because there's always, what you see on social media and like how amazing birth can be or how traumatic birth can be. You tend to see the extreme sides of the spectrum, but there's so much in between. And there's things that you just don't hear as often that I think are really important to talk about.
Mm, I love that. I love that. Okay. Are you doing anything you want to chat with us about before we jump in? With the podcast, do you have any cool things you want to
Mm.
talk about that have been coming up in your world as well
Oh
that you want to
man.
share?
There's so many moving parts in my life right now and I mean, you know, I if anybody wants to share their birth story or their birth experience, like, and it's not just for people that have had children themselves, it's like birth workers that support people, like any role that you carry in the birth space, your story and perspective deserve to be heard and valued as well. And so if you want to share, you can fill out the guest request form and I will review it and we'll chat and we'll see how we can get your story heard.
I love it. I love it. I might talk about one of my stories with you. That could be fun.
Yeah.
I have a good ripper and home birth story that Jen may have had to resuscitate my daughter at.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Maybe we'll do a Zoomy kind of three of us thing and we can tell it from the
Yeah.
provider side and the client side,
Oh, I would
right?
love
What it
that.
was
I
like.
would love
That could
that.
be super fun. What do you think,
Yes.
Jen? You can voice in for that. She'll voice in.
Oh, I would love to tell the story about how I had to take your baby out of your arms and say, "Hey, can I maybe breathe for her now?"
Mm-hmm.
Because it
Yes.
takes a
Goodness.
minute to get back in your body. We know this. right?
It
Right after
does.
birth. Okay. The healing is in the conversation.
I did
Please
put a little, sorry, thing
go
in the
ahead.
chat to maybe start some conversation around not only that traumatic birth is real, but that like traumatic birth is manufactured as a piece of uninformed coercion.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Just that statement in itself is so heavy because there's so many layers beneath that. Um, yeah, just let me know what direction you want me to take that because
Well,
there's
okay, let's start right there because, of course, we're working with midwives, right? So a lot of the midwives are dealing in that veil space, right? Like, so unveiling the power is actually unveiling some of the word usage and the power of our words and how they shape stories. And Jen said in the comments here for people who are listening, I often find they need their trauma reframed that it wasn't as a life or death situation as it was presented, but it was uninformed coercion. Hospitals often create fear and trauma out of nothing. For example, the cord was wrapped around my baby's neck and they almost strangled to death. We've
mm,
all heard that story, right?
mhm.
And midwives who have graduated, and a lot of healthcare providers know that that's not really what's happening. That's not where oxygen exchange is happening, right? Now, do we want excessive cord compression? Do we want excessive strangulation on any part of a baby's body? Absolutely not,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
But it's so we can start right there. Like the power of words and what happens in these spaces that are so powerful and how susceptible we can be. Can you talk a little bit more on what happens like in birth and how sensitive people can be around
Oh,
words?
absolutely. Oh my gosh, the choice of words that a provider uses, or even just your birth team and support team around you, the choice of words that you use truly impacts how your birth falls, like how it unfolds, and then how you yourself think of your birth and your ability and capability of actually birthing your baby through your body. And the reason why the word choice is so important is because there's that fear tactic, right? There's,
Mhm,
oh man, your baby is so big and you're
mhm,
only 36 weeks. Like, are you sure you don't want to get an induction at 38 weeks?
mhm,
Because it could be better, So it's like, I feel like the choice of words truly determines whether or not the person who is birthing has the agency and like wherewithal to like believe in themselves to be able
mhm,
to actually do the thing. Now, another example of vocabulary or word choice is the simple word contraction, right? When you think of contraction,
mhm,
it's automatically associated with pain because it's like tightening and tense and it's like contracting, right? Like something is contracting or um, causing pain, which is why some people prefer not to use the word contraction and use the word surge or wave so that you can know that there's a start, a peak, and an end to it rather than it just attacking you, right? Um, Another great example of word choice is when people are preparing for their birth experience, when you say they are the only ones that know the line between coping and suffering, they get to decide what that means. Because if someone comes in and says, "Oh my gosh, you're being so loud. Do you need an epidural? It sounds like you're suffering." And it's really like, "No, I'm coping through my vocalizations. So please don't offer that to me. That's not what I want right now." But if somebody does offer that and they say, "Yeah, actually, I really want that," then great. That's awesome because that's what they needed. But
mhm.
when you use words to impose your emotions or feelings as an outsider on the person who is birthing, it can impact the way they think about their ability to birth as well.
I just put that note in coping versus suffering. What great
Mhm.
language usage.
Yeah.
Because a lot of it too is right. What do we know about birth? We don't get to force, we don't get to control. We can
Mhm.
create and we can flow.
Mhm.
And we might be kicking and screaming, flowing at times,
Right.
right? Like sometimes we're running full force into it because the flow feels great. And sometimes we are not loving where the flow might be going, right?
Right.
So when we know that more rigidity will hurt us in our decision
Mhm.
making, in our reluctance to make different choices, how do we stay fluid and softening word choice to coping versus suffering, to where do you know that line in your own body? And it's so much about what midwifery and birth really help a lot of people understand, which is self-governance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is emotional responsibility, which is
Mm-hmm.
understanding your needs and voicing them without shame, right?
Mm-hmm.
And making sure they get met,
Right.
right? And thankfully, we have about 10 months before we have to do the birth. So you
Right.
got some time to get your people, your thoughts, your energy a little bit more like this baby will come out. Do
Mm-hmm.
I get to determine exactly how it's going to go? No, but I can help myself feel more empowered,
Mm-hmm.
right? Feel aligned to the fact that as much as this may be nothing I've ever done before, I'm also available for it. I'm
Mm-hmm.
capable,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And how am I going to ensure that? I'm not going to pretend it's not going to have pain, or let's not even call it pain. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't have a little bit of effort
Mm-hmm.
involved,
Yeah.
that there's
Yeah.
not an intensity involved. I'm
Right.
going to
Right.
acknowledge it head on.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so there's a few things that I want to touch on there, which is, the 10-month time span. That that is time where people can actually unlearn a lot of things that are forced on them, or societal expectations of people when it comes to birthing a baby. Um, or so there's a time to unlearn what's expected and learn what's out there and what your options are. So being able to widen your thoughts, and to which leads me to my second point of following your intuition and knowing that you know your body best, even though this is your first time doing this. Um, you know your body best. You can have your birth team that surrounds you be a guide and offer feedback and like help you decide what it is that you want to do in your birthing experience. But when it comes to knowing what your body is capable of, you yourself have to believe it, because birth is just as much psychological as it is physical. And I heard you kind of trying to figure out what word to use when it came to pain or intensity. And one of the words that I love using is power, because it's power that comes from within, and it's like you and your body, your ability. Like, I try my best when I'm talking to clients to have them think of like how powerful their contractions are versus how painful their contractions are. Because when they think of power, they can put it into this place in their mind where it's them talking about how powerful their body is, which is why it's so intense, because it's doing what it's supposed to do, versus, oh my gosh, this is a lot, and this is happening to me, versus this is something my body is doing. So when we choose those kinds of words to describe what we're going through and what is happening, it can really shift the mindset of how someone truly prepares for their birth and births in the moment.
Perfect. I love that. So what brought you, if you don't mind me asking, what brought you into into the depth of healing is in the conversation? And you don't have to
Oh,
go into a personal if you don't want to. If you want to, by all means. But what actually got you inside understanding that was a strength that you brought forward to help people?
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like it's hard to not talk about like personal aspects of it, because I'm an open book, right? Like everything I do with passion, and I do full on. So the healing and the conversation part came from the the aspect of me personally wanting to be heard, validated, and um, actually, what's the word? Valued, validated, and just heard truly. And so in order to get that, you have to open up. You have to have a conversation, and you have to be able to have an actual conversation and not just be talked at, but you have to be a good listener, and you have to be able to hang on to the parts of the conversation that are important enough to bring up again, and and go deeper. You have to go deeper. And that's why I created my podcast, is because there's a lot of birth story podcasts out there, which is amazing. But I think it's truly important to get the full story, because many birth story podcasts focus on only that, the birth story. My podcast focuses on conception, pregnancy, the entire labor, birth, postpartum, as well as like some of the psychological aspects of postpartum and like where people are now. And The reason why I really talk about conception, there was one person who I heard listening to my podcast, and they were like, conception, everybody knows how babies are made. And I was like, well, really? There's the fun part, but then there's also the times when it's not so fun. It's more of a transactional event. And it's also something that people don't just get so easily all the time. So talking about conception is so important. And so when people hear other people's stories about the conception process, rather than, oh my God, yeah, we had a baby, this is great. When you hear about the conception process, you're like, oh, I had to go through IVF too. Or, oh, I actually had a miscarriage between my second and third as well.
Mm.
So when you have a conversation and you give people the space to actually be heard, they will open up, they'll be more vulnerable with you, and there's going to be somebody out there that's going to be able to relate to what that person is talking about. And that itself is healing. Like being heard and valued and appreciated is so healing. And it makes it to where you are no longer isolated in this island of this, it's just me. And nobody wants to talk about it because it's the hard part. Or no one wants me to talk about it because they think I'm bragging because it's amazing and I had an amazing experience. So it's truly such a wide spectrum of how having a conversation is truly healing, especially with someone that knows how to listen well.
Mm-hmm. The value of presence,
Correct.
right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people have a hard time sitting with their own stories. And
Mm-hmm.
it's unfortunate because the cost of that is presence,
Mm-hmm.
right? I was talking to my son about self-consciousness versus self-awareness, right?
Mm.
You don't want to be so self-conscious that you're constantly tearing yourself down. That's not self-aware, that's abusive,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And I, especially as a birth worker, entering spaces, if I enter with an energy of self-consciousness, like being very over aware of how I'm being perceived, am I going to do my best work? Versus being aware of myself in the situation, aware of myself with the specific family, right? The real relevance and relativity of the person to person care. That presence means that I get to be aware. And when I'm aware and I'm not worried about what anybody else is thinking, and I'm just sitting in that presence, I get to share, like you said, I get to be a good listener.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't about me. I'm
Yeah.
aware of my function and the service of what is happening in the greater whole, right?
Mm-hmm.
Teaching student midwives, there is self-consciousness in the beginning of following any craft, right? Right.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, being exceptionally arrogant or foolhardy could result in bad mistakes, right? So
Right.
self-consciousness, it's smart because it does let us know certain limits, but in the communication space and unchecked in our own emotional and mental health, it can wreak havoc. It can appear as anxiety and ungroundedness and inability to be present for others because we
Right.
have not been able to be present for ourselves because we've
Mm-hmm.
been too scared what people might think and that we might mess up, insert
Right.
anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I find when we talk, and this goes well, like when we talk about birth and people who give birth, right? The being able to show up for ourselves without having to dictate circumstance, to be aware while things may change, but not lose value, not lose sense of self-worth.
Mm-hmm.
Understand that, like, hey, this is big and I'm going to need to process this, but to not feel so overwhelmed. There's a safety about being safe in our lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
Childbirth pushes on the maternal safety because childbirth has eliminated many lives over time,
Mm-hmm.
right? And epigenetically, we still don't know C-sections help now. Our
Right.
genes don't know that. So already there's a low lying, sorry, my thingy's beeping at me.
You're okay.
There's a low lying anxiety already in childbirth that's epigenetic because yeah, you could die,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Birth is as guaranteed as life,
Yeah, you're
you
seriously,
know?
truly walking that line every single time.
Mhm.
Um, and it's really scary for some people as well when they look at the statistics, for example, Black women, right? Like when I am supporting Black clients, I have some that are completely terrified and they know that they're going in for a C-section. They're like, Kiona, please don't let me die.
Mhm.
To have to hear that from someone that I care about, because I have developed this relationship with my client, for them to look at me and say, Kiona, please don't let me die. I as the role of a birth doula, there's nothing I could do, right?
Mhm.
Outside of
Mhm.
voicing things that say, hey, let me advocate here. But truly, my client in that position, in every position when they're birthing, is so extremely vulnerable. And
Yeah.
they have to let go. And I know that phrase could be really tricky for some as well, letting go. What are you
Mhm.
letting go of? What is it that you're letting go of, and how do you let go and still hold on at the same time?
Mhm. Yeah.
So it's very, very interesting. And then I also wanted to touch on you using the term aware. I love that you're using awareness versus presence, because when you're aware of your surroundings, when you're aware of your emotions, and when you're aware of when others are like imposing their emotions onto you, it makes it easier to make decisions, and it makes it easier to understand what next step to take. So awareness is truly, truly, truly important. Um, which also kind of made me think of, like, the phrase birth preferences, birth versus birth plan. Because when
Mhm.
you're aware that when you create this plan, that 99% of the time it's not going to go as planned, it doesn't mean that it's going to go bad, right? It doesn't mean that just because it didn't go as planned or as you had hoped for, that it's a negative outcome. It's just, these are my preferences, and it didn't happen exactly as that happened, but in this entire process of this labor and birth, pregnancy, labor and birth, and postpartum, I had the ability to make an informed decision and to change the direction in the way that was necessary without giving up all of my agency in my birth experience. So,
Truly.
yeah.
Truly, right? Because hyperreactivity, hyper individuality, all or noneness, rigidity,
Mhm.
man, right? It is
Mhm.
no fun in the birth
Right.
space, right? There is, because birth's going to take as long as it takes. It's going to
Mhm.
happen the way it happens,
Right.
right? Um, I was loving everything you were saying. I'm like, oh man, when I would walk my clients through kind of a visualization of, right, really getting into, like, why do we even plan, why do we have birth preferences, right? and
Mhm.
and it's playing into the nuance of, you think you want it to go this way because you have good data for some things, obvious, like that's great, well educated, good choices, well informed, love that. But why do you really think you want your birth to go this way? How do you think
Mhm.
that's going to make you feel, right?
Right.
And so instead of putting all of the feelings of being proud of ourselves, being safe, being happy with our choices, really happy with what happens, out into this uncontrollable outside element, I would walk them through visualizations earlier in pregnancy around, like, now get into the feeling of that, right? Feel your partner with you, feel this ideal situation, feel it all the way through. And let's hold that feeling. And one by one, we're going to walk some of these things out of there because risk changed. And so it was like more
Yeah.
of a group meditation we would do in group prenatal. But
Mhm.
you're not going to lose your partner, right? But we may
Mhm.
have to transfer,
Mhm.
right? You may be ruptured a little too long. And so it was really, and being able to work through that feels scary. Okay, let's go back to this feeling of your birth going perfectly. And
Mhm.
let's hold the feeling while things change. Can we play with that space of understanding that, like you said, just because it doesn't go exactly the way you want does not mean it went bad.
Right.
And holding that space of the autonomy, right? I like to tell people, just because it's uncertain does not mean it's unsafe. And so
Mm.
many of us, if it's uncertain, there's an anxiety. And a
Mhm.
lot of it's performance anxiety, but I was never allowed to be uncertain in my life. But if it
Mhm.
messes up, it's all on me and the whole world falls apart and we're dead now, right?
Right.
Like the
Mhm.
intensity of some of that rejection to uncertainty. When really, if we can court good relationship with uncertainty through big waves, like having babies through the seasons of our lives, the things we'll encounter. That is that staying in the center of awareness, right?
Right.
I am okay. I may not like this, and this may not be what I want, but how can I stay as supported, as centered as I am and as I can be, knowing that the whole reason I'm here was to feel these things. I want to feel empowered and alive and like I'm a good enough mom. So let's not put that on where the baby comes out and how.
Right.
Let's just do that now. Let's grow you energetically and mentally right into exactly what you said you wanted and is already happening. And let that be happening now. Because that presence, it's so great. We're talking the power of labor. To get through the power, to work with the power of labor requires immense presence. Right?
Yeah, it truly does. Because when you're focused on that clock of like, how long is this going to take? Like, so many people go into what I call like the birth zone. I know everybody has used this term before, but going into the birth zone of when you're not paying attention to what is happening. You're literally taking it one surge at a time and you're getting through that moment. And that is how you continue to like, like walk forward and like make progress. But once people get too kind of like too conscious in their present physical body in a way that they want to control it versus work with it, that makes a huge difference as well. So, yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Jen and I have often said, a lot of the time trauma results from lack of choice or removal of choice, where
Yeah.
access was reduced, education was reduced, right?
Mm-hmm.
Availability of support, resources, time, whatever it is. And again, that may not, if it's perceived as reduced, it's reduced in that story.
Right.
Because the story that goes forward is real, right?
Right.
And what can we hope for everyone? That they have a story that they don't have to spend time unweaving so that they can find peace. So I want to hear a little bit more when we talk about the healing is in the conversation. Do you see grief when people start to relearn their birth stories?
Oh, absolutely.
Can you tell
Absolutely.
us a little bit more about like the energetics and the emotion of that rewriting?
I have interviewed people who tell their stories from 30 years ago, and they're still crying when they're talking about, I couldn't breastfeed as long as I wanted, or they're still crying when they have that realization that I didn't feel that boost of oxytocin right at the start when my baby came out. I was just exhausted and distant and numb. Like they're still emotional from that. And so when people are telling their stories, especially, I truly love when there is a guest that comes on and they tell their stories and it's like a challenging birth that is followed by a redemptive birth, and the things that they did differently and why they did them differently and how they did them differently. Sometimes that means changing birth settings, right? Sometimes that's like, I'm not going to birth at the hospital, I'm going to be at home, and vice versa. There are times when people birth at hospitals and they're like, or sorry, people birth at home and they're like, that was way too traumatic for me because I didn't have what I needed, I didn't feel blah, blah, whatever. And then they go to the hospital and they're like, okay, like I felt safer there because this is what happened at my first birth. So going back to the healing is in the conversation, people truly feel like when I am hearing people tell their birth stories, what you're hearing is not necessarily how painful it was. You're hearing how they felt emotionally and like how they were cared for in the process. That is what people remember most, is how were you cared for? Were you heard? Were you um, put into a position where you were able to make informed decisions? Or was every decision made for you? And how did that make you feel? Were you in a different country? Was there a language barrier? What are these things that you had to go through? And how did it make you feel? Those feelings are what people are sharing in their stories. And because the stories are so based on feeling, it's impossible to not heal as you talk about it because you're processing the entire time. So that the grievances that happen in stories, I have had so many people tell me, oh, it feels so good to actually like tell my story because it was a hard birth and everybody wants to talk about how amazing birth is and I don't want to scare people. But now I got to tell my story and you're helping me process this and heal from this trauma that I experienced to then kind of have a better outlook on how things turned out. So I hope that makes sense.
It does. It
Okay.
does, and I think, and I was like, of course they have grief, Jess. What kind of question was that? Of course they do. If it was traumatic, there's grief. And I think what I was I think what I was almost asking is, as stuff starts to process out, is there almost a grief of how long they've held it on their body? Does
Mm-hmm.
that make sense? Like when they start to be like a movement into a relief and a reframe that gives them a little more breathing space, right?
Yeah.
There can be simultaneous relief with, I can't believe I held on to that for
Yeah.
so long in my body. And in my mind right now, I'm thinking of people in their 20s with C-section trauma.
Mm.
Or like not in their 20s, I'm sorry. C-section trauma from over 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I know a few people who have C-section trauma from over 20 years ago that I feel that like they want it off their body. And
Right.
so they're finding these ways, but as they expand into this relief they're getting, they have this almost like survivor's guilt grief, but it's this, why did I carry it for so long? Right. And it's so interesting when that happens. As you can see, I'm holding my heart. There's
Yeah.
such a grace,
Mm-hmm.
right, and a compassion that like really has to flow through as we reframe stories, whether it is a birth trauma, an abuse history, a loss of a parent, trauma, and how it impacts us, how it dings our entire being, right, and how we move forward. People will get scared about the reframe because they think that they'll lose the ability to stand up for something that hurt them and they don't ever want to go through that pain again. And it's actually the reframe is going to heal the pain, right? We're not going to chase the snake that bit you and tell the snake it's a piece of shit, right?
Right.
We're going to actually heal the bite. We're going to get rid of the scar tissue. We're going to help you, right? And maybe we're going to move somewhere where snakes don't live.
Right.
If you can.
Right.
We're going to make some choices, but do you see how that it's sense of empowerment is that difference? There is a way out of this. There are options and opportunities that will help me continue to increase, expand, and improve where I'm at and how I'm feeling. And sometimes getting to there, you get the expansion and then the, oh my God, contraction. And then you get the expansion and then the contraction, right? And just like labor, right? Healing is like that.
Yeah.
And every time a little more light gets in that space, and it does stay a little bit longer. So when we talk about reframing traumatic birth stories, we're not saying we're going to take your trauma and invalidate it.
Right.
What we're really talking about is actually going to give it all the space to have the full opportunity to express and release so that the bindings on the being no longer exist from the traumatic. Right.
Yeah.
It is. It's a play on that, right? To want to defend and also let go. Like you said, how do we surrender? How do we let go? And also know it is certain that we are well blessedly contained. And it's such a play, right? Jen says in the chat, I think social media and the stories of perfect, natural, crunchy birth that was easy, blissful, or orgasmic makes many women who had their uneducated, birth feel like a failure because they didn't love being in labor and they acknowledge and feel guilt. They're unmedicated birth, not uneducated. Thank God. I was like, I'm going to back up on that. I don't know what. Thank you, Jen. Jen means unmedicated. Okay. Makes any woman who had an unmedicated birth feel like they're a failure because they are. I can't read this right now, Jen. Yeah. So what we're going to say is people start to feel like this almost vicarious shame that they didn't have a picture perfect labor. And let's go even farther to the marketing of that.
Yeah.
Oh, look. Oh, look. Oh, look. Oh, look. Beautiful story. Foreman in 58 beautifully edited auto,
Mhm.
music over at home birth video that of my
Mhm.
36-hour first birth where my husband spoon fed me honey. Put it together all beautifully for you, right? Here you go, 4 minutes. That's
Yeah,
just for you, right? And so the marketing aspect of social media, this is not a conversation that existed 10 years ago.
correct.
The
Yeah.
impacts of social media on
Mhm.
the advocacy, education, and access
Mhm.
that can be presumed in birth for all people, especially, and we'll just keep it to America, but around the world.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's so true. Social media is as much as I love to see these amazing positive birth experiences that people are having and the unmedicated, like, even like free births that people are having at home where the partner's catching babe and everything is fine and then they celebrate and it's so exciting. That is great for the people that it works for. But that itself is not birth for everyone. And that itself is not a safe option for everyone, even when it comes to the choice of medication or no medication. Because they're like, we're talking about grief and trauma and like what that looks like in the space and how we heal that through conversation. The the most healing thing that you can say when it comes to hanging on to grief in the body is release it, but like meet it where it's at, like cuz you can't ignore just like when someone has been, for example, sexually assaulted, right? You feel that and that stays with you and your body does whatever it needs to do to compartmentalize and put it away until it's triggered and you're like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't even know this was a thing for me and this is how do I deal with this?" The same
Mhm.
thing can happen for really traumatic births because it is your body that is going through that process and your body holds that. It holds
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
That's how come there are people who had a really traumatic birth, but then they get pregnant again and they're terrified because they're like, what what's going to happen? Is it going to happen again? Is it even possible for me to have a positive birth experience after this? How much agency do I have? How much control do I have? Because some people will be told, ah, you had a C-section the first time. Let's just get back on the OR table. So there's so many moving parts to stories and how to heal and how to even carry grief and how to process grief because it could be held in so many different ways.
Absolutely. I mean, we could have a whole 3-hour podcast. We could have a whole like at least just as an introduction to even the topics. So we could have the similar working dialogue to get into
Right.
it, right?
Hmm.
But I do like that you're bringing up the somatics of it and the body and the physiologics of trauma. One, it takes it out of it being a brain space thing.
Right.
Okay. When there's trauma, and when you're a 3D human being and you live a life, you're going to run into some things.
Right.
And when it happens, right? I'm not going to say, buck up, chap, punch myself in the face and say, be more resilient, right?
Right.
This is not the 20th century. We're not trying to do that to ourselves anymore and call it good work or willpower, right? We are going
Right.
to address the need that the trauma, like when it happens, right? So
Hmm.
birth space, gee, it can be traumatic if your child gets harassed or bullied at school. That can happen
Hmm.
in any day too. What the heck happened? My child was violated, right? Let's
Hmm.
take it out of this concept of the birth, this one big event, right? So like when shit happens, right? How quickly and how able are we to hold the space for the power of potentiality, and that in that uncertainty we can help direct through autonomy and self-governance, grab our resources, get our people, and help ourselves, right?
Right.
So much of the healing is actually believing you have enough to make a difference, that it can shift,
Hmm.
right? And does that mean we get to go back and go in a time machine and not have our C-sections? Or go in a time machine and beat up the kid's bully? No. But it does mean that we get to soften, soften, soften so that the waves don't feel so big as life continues on.
Hmm. Hmm.
I
Yeah.
wish we could just say, like, if there was going to, and I don't wish, I would say it'd be great if all we had to talk about was just birth trauma. I don't like
Right.
talking about birth trauma. I want zero birth trauma. But if that were the only thing impacting the maternal population, we could at least work on it. But
Mhm.
because life itself has a way sometimes of being big and heavy, and if you do not know how to help release, like you said, to release it from the body, it can feel like a dam
Mm.
starts to back up and build up.
Mhm.
And then do you think it gets easier in motherhood? No.
Yeah.
So every way we can release the somatics, getting it out of our brain and out of our bodies, both, right? Not like in so many ways, all I want to do is grab and hold tight anyone who's experienced this trauma and tell them it's not your fault. It's not
Mhm.
your, it was not okay. Right. But
Right.
let's open to okay now as much as we can to release the time freeze that trauma really puts on our systems. Because that's what
Right.
it is. It's a stuck in time energy that, that they want to shake as well.
Mhm.
So building not so much resilience, but building I don't like how this feels. I'm going to pay
Mhm.
attention right now. What do I
Mhm.
need? The ability to self-aware, not, oh shit, I feel like I'm getting anxiety again. The self-consciousness.
Mhm.
Oh no, I thought I did this work. Oh, and falling into the stories, but actually, okay, this energy is an indicator. I am triggered as shit. This is coming up. I may have a past of this, but I am okay now. What can I do? These are the
Mhm.
conversations that really
Yes.
help people stand tall. I do deserve community. I do deserve to be helped, even when I don't know what to do. And I'm 15 years away from the event, but
Mhm.
I can. There is something different. I can have more. I can
Yeah.
feel better about this.
Yeah. When there are those large gaps between traumatic event and conversation, it's so challenging because they got so used to shoving it down, right? It's been 15 years. Like, why? It doesn't bother me anymore. It's been 15 years. But truly, when people have conversations with people that are ready to open their ears to what you're talking about without judgment and with empathy and compassion, you kind of get that, um, for lack of a better term, you get that permission to let it exist
Mhm.
and to say, okay, this was traumatic for me. And it's so easy for us as people in general to do this comparative suffering. My traumatic wasn't as bad. I didn't lose my baby, so I'm okay. I didn't
Mm.
lose my uterus, so I'm okay. I didn't, um, you know, I lost one twin, but I have the other, so I'm okay. Like I have a baby, right? So every single one of these scenarios is traumatic in itself. It does not even have the ability to be compared to the next. And so when you have the conversation with people that are in the space to be able to hold you where you're at and for you to like feel validated in that your trauma was traumatic, even though it wasn't as bad, quote unquote, as your neighbor. Your trauma is your trauma, and you carry your trauma in a way that nobody else carries their trauma.
Mhm.
So, having the conversations can truly be healing with that, to
Mm.
get that, like, that permission that you didn't know you needed. So,
Yeah. Yeah, the space,
right.
right? For
Mhm.
it to not stay frozen in time.
Right. Yeah.
It is so, that's beautiful. Kiona, I'm so grateful that you had this chat with me today.
Yeah.
Where can everybody find you? Birth as We Know It podcast. Where else?
Yeah, so you can, if you want to listen to the podcast, you can just search up Birth as We Know It on any podcast streaming platform. And if you want to connect with me directly, you can go to birthasweknowitpodcast.com. And I am also on socials everywhere as Birth as We Know It. So,
I love that. Yes. And Kiona's podcast is amazing. Thank you so much. Our chat's blowing up with it. I love that.
yeah.
Um, Kiona, this has been fantastic. And do you serve as a doula currently as well? Where are you
I
serving?
do. Yes, I am located in Washington. So I serve the greater Seattle area. Another thing that I'm also offering is labor prep from a doula perspective. So I am in the process of getting trained as a childbirth educator, but I've been to so many births, and I think that I still have value in the information that I can pass along to those that either want a refresher or don't have the time for a super long childbirth education course. So I'm offering that both in person and virtual. And it's just labor prep from a doula perspective. It's like a 2 to 3 hour little session where we just talk all the things.
I love it. That sounds fantastic. I'm so excited. I'm going to look at that. That's so cool because I'm like 2 to 3 hours at this point. I think that's what we're going to get when it comes to attention spans on certain things. But it's
Right.
kind of great because we're used to so much information coming in faster. I'm so happy about that. So I love it. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Kiona, for joining me.
Yes.
Kiona Nessenbaum with the Birth as We Know It podcast. All
Yeah.
right.
Thank you.
I will see everybody next week. Thanks for joining Birth Working.
Thank you.
All right, and I'll trim that there. So good to
Awesome.
see you. Hi, Mary. Hi, Scott. Nice to meet you. Mary is a beautiful midwife. She joined us today.